She left her husband and son at 30, lived freely until 55 with nothing left. Now she was broke, 55, and had to crawl back. But something inside her felt free. The phone rang at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning in October. I was in the kitchen, standing at the counter in my bathrobe, staring at the coffee maker I still hadn't figured out how to program right. It was one of those machines with 17 buttons and a display screen that always seemed to be scolding me for not reading the manual. The caller ID said Margaret S., and for a split second I thought I was still dreaming. Margaret and I had spoken maybe 3 times in the past 22 years. Not because we had fallen out. Because she had disappeared, not from memory, but from the ordinary world where people pick up phones and answer texts and show up for birthday dinners and remember to wish you a happy new year. Margaret? I said, pressing the phone hard against my ear, my heart suddenly beating too fast for a 6:47 Tuesday morning. Don't Margaret me, Carolyn. Her voice was exactly as I remembered, that low, slightly hoarse rasp that made everything she said sound like she was telling you a secret at a party where the secrets were the only honest thing in the room. I'm at the bus station in Hartford. I need you to come get me. I set my coffee down. It wasn't hot enough to burn my hand, but I felt the heat anyway, spreading from my chest upward into my throat, my face. Hartford was 40 minutes away. The bus station in Hartford was not a place anyone called you from unless things were very bad or very final. Margaret, where are you coming from? I'm coming from the last goddamn bus from New York because I spent my last $40 on the ticket and I have $11 in my pocket and I need a place to sleep tonight. Are you coming or not? I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my keys off the hook by the door. Tom's truck was already gone. He'd left at 6 for a site meeting in New Haven. I told my husband I'd explain later through a text I wasn't sure he'd see before noon. And I drove 40 minutes on roads I barely remember, my hands so tight on the wheel they ached, my mind racing ahead to build the story I would need to make sense of what I was about to find. She was sitting on a bench outside the bus station beside a single black garbage bag that held everything she owned in the world. She was 55 years old. Her hair, once a cascade of chestnut waves that I used to braid for her in college, back when we were 18 and thought the world was a place you could simply walk into and be welcomed, was cut short and gray and stuck out from her head in ways that made her look like something the wind had left behind. She wore a faded blue rain jacket 2 sizes too big, canvas sneakers with holes in both toes, and no makeup. I had never in my entire life seen Margaret Sullivan without makeup. Not once. Not even at 7 a.m. in college, not even at the beach, not even when she had food poisoning at a cabin in Vermont and I was holding a bucket for her while she wept about how she looked. She looked up when she heard my car door. And for a moment, neither of us moved. She smiled. It was not a broken smile, not a defeated one. It was the same Margaret smile I knew from our dorm room at NYU 28 years ago, the one that said she knew something you didn't, something exciting and dangerous and just a little bit too good for polite company. The one that had made every professor call on her in class not because she raised her hand but because they couldn't take their eyes off her. The one that had broken a dozen hearts in our graduating class without her ever intending to break any of them. You look old, Carolyn, she said. I laughed so hard I cried. And then I was crying for real, not from laughter at all, and I walked over and wrapped my arms around her. She smelled like bus station, cheap coffee and sweat and something faintly floral underneath, like she had put on perfume years ago and it had never fully faded, like her body had decided to hold on to one last piece of who she used to be. She was so thin. I could feel her shoulder blades through the rain jacket like 2 small wings. Get in the car, you idiot, I said. Love quiet, Forbidden midlife romance? Subscribe to Noah's Awakening for more slow burn stories. I didn't ask questions on the drive to my house. She didn't volunteer answers. She sat in the passenger seat with her garbage bag at her feet, watching the Connecticut countryside scroll past, the maples just turning, the early October blaze of orange and red and gold, the stone walls, the white farmhouses, the church steeples rising out of small towns that had been there since before the country had a name, with an expression I couldn't read. Contentment? Relief? Disappointment? It was all of those things and none of them, like she was watching a film she had seen before but was somehow seeing for the first time. My husband, Tom, was already at work. He ran a small construction company, nothing like the Sullivan's Empire or the Ashford Millions, just 12 employees and a yard full of equipment in New Haven. I made coffee the old way on the stovetop, which Margaret always said was the only right way, that the Italian women in my neighborhood would be ashamed of my electric machine, and we sat at my kitchen table, the same oak table where my kids had done their homework for 15 years, where I had signed permission slips and birthday cards and my divorce papers from my first husband, before Tom, back when I was young enough to make terrible mistakes and old enough to fix them. She told me everything. Not all at once. Margaret was never a linear storyteller. She was like a jazz musician. She'd start a theme, wander off into a riff, come back to the main melody 2 sentences later, and somehow by the end you'd heard the whole symphony, every movement, every key change, every moment of silence between the notes that meant as much as the notes themselves. She told me about leaving Robert. Not walking out. She hadn't technically walked out in the traditional sense, hadn't packed boxes or called a moving company or screamed her grievances in the master bedroom while Connor cried in the nursery down the hall. She had been standing in the doorway of the nursery, looking at her newborn son, this red-faced, screaming, miraculous little stranger she had made with her body, this impossible result of a marriage she had never fully chosen, and she felt nothing. No, that wasn't right. She felt everything. The weight of a life that had been decided for her before she was old enough to know there were other options. Before she was old enough to understand that options existed. I looked at that baby, and I loved him, she said, turning her coffee cup in both hands, not meeting my eyes, looking instead at the steam rising from the cup like it was the most important thing in the room. I want you to understand that, Carolyn. I need you to understand that before I tell you the rest. I loved him more than I'd ever loved anything. More than I had known it was possible to love anything. But I also felt like I was being buried alive. Do you know what I mean? Like someone was shoveling dirt over me and everyone was smiling and saying how beautiful it was that I was starting a family. And I kept thinking, where is the air? I can't breathe. And no one could see it. No one could see that I was suffocating. She had been 29 when she married Robert Sullivan III. He was 34. It was 1994, and Margaret Ashford, heiress to Ashford Industrial, the third-generation hardware manufacturing empire founded by her grandfather in Bridgeport in 1947, a company that made everything from door hinges to industrial drilling equipment, a company that employed 400 people and had a pension plan that had survived 3 recessions, was wearing a very wedding dress at a reception at the Delano Hotel in South Florida, smiling for photographs, accepting checks from relatives who had opinions about her future but no interest in asking her questions about what she wanted. Robert was handsome. Tall, sandy-haired, with that easy East Coast money confidence that made women weak and men defensive. He had an MBA from Wharton and a handshake that was firm without being aggressive. He had inherited a commercial real estate portfolio from his father, Sullivan Development, a company his grandfather had started in the 1960s building strip malls along the Connecticut coast, and had doubled it in 5 years through a combination of aggressive acquisition and the kind of deal-making that happened over golf rather than over desks. He was, by every metric that mattered to the people who arranged their lives around metrics, an extraordinary catch. The problem, and Margaret knew this on the wedding day, standing at the altar in her Vera Wang, watching Robert's eyes fill with tears of what he believed was joy, was that she didn't love him. She didn't love him the way the song said she should, the way the movies promised she would, the way her mother had once described love to her as a girl, that thing that made you want to be better, softer, more present. She liked him. She respected him. She found him physically attractive in a showroom kind of way, the way you might admire a well-maintained classic car. But the fire, the madness, the thing that made you text someone at 2 a.m. just because you needed to hear their voice, she had felt that once, with a boy named Daniel who worked at a bookshop on Greenwich Avenue when she was 22, and her father had made it very clear that Daniel, who was sweet and broke and studying poetry and working behind a counter for $6.50 an hour, was not the kind of man who would benefit Margaret's future or the Ashford family's legacy. Daniel disappeared within 6 weeks. Margaret never saw him again. She heard later, through the grapevine of Bridgeport society, which was smaller and more invasive than any internet, that he had moved to Oregon, that he had married a woman who taught yoga, that he had published a book of poems no one had heard of except the people who loved him. She ordered the book once, under a fake name, from a bookstore in Boston. She read it on a Saturday afternoon in her engagement bathroom, sitting on the edge of the marble tub, and she cried for an hour, and then she got dressed and went to a dinner with Robert and his parents, and she did not tell anyone, not ever, what those poems had done to her. "So I married Robert," she said, sitting in my kitchen at age 55, saying the words as casually as if she were describing a haircut she'd regret. "And for 2 years it was fine. Better than fine. He was attentive and ambitious, and he made me look good at charity galas. He remembered the names of my favorite flowers, gardenias, which are his mother's favorite too, which should have been my first clue that I was marrying into a family that would absorb me rather than embrace me. He made love like clockwork every Sunday morning, and I would close my eyes, and sometimes I would think of the ocean, and sometimes I would think of nothing at all, and both of those felt like a failure of a different kind. We were a matched set. Power couple. The Bridgeport Journal wrote a feature on us, the power couple of the next generation. I kept a copy in my nightstand. I used to read it when I couldn't sleep, trying to convince myself it was real. She looked at me with those sharp green eyes, still beautiful, even now, even ruined, even exhausted from a night on a bus with $11 in her pocket and the accumulated weight of 25 years of running, and she said, "Do you know what the worst part of a dead marriage is? It's not the fighting. It's not the violence. It's not even the betrayal, though that comes later and it is its own particular devastation. It's the pretending. You get so good at it that you forget you're doing it. You wake up one morning and you can't remember who you were before you started performing. And by then, your whole life is the performance. You don't know the lines anymore because there never were any real lines. There was just the script they gave you and the character you learned to play, and somewhere in the middle of Act 2, the actress and the character became the same person and you lost track of which one was which. The baby, their son, Connor, was born in March of 1998. Margaret was 30 years old. She left 6 weeks later. Love quiet, forbidden midlife romance? Subscribe to Noah's Awakening for more slow burn stories. "I wrote Robert a letter," she said. "I know that's cowardly. I know. If I had an ounce of the courage I thought I had, I would have woken him up and told him to his face. But I couldn't stand in front of him and say it, because the look on his face would have broken me, Carolyn. It would have broken the very thin, very fragile resolve I had managed to build over the course of a single afternoon in that nursery. So I wrote him a letter. I sat at the writing desk in our bedroom, the one Robert
had bought as a wedding gift to me, mahogany, leather top, from a dealer in Manhattan, and I wrote him a 6-page letter and I told him everything. I told him I was not the woman he married. I told him I was going to destroy his life if I stayed, not metaphorically, not dramatically, but practically, because a woman who is drowning will pull her husband under too, and Robert did not deserve to drown. I told him I would sign anything. I told him I would agree to anything. I told him I would give him full custody. I would take nothing. I would walk away from every dollar and every asset and every social connection our marriage had built. I just needed to go. I needed to breathe. I needed to find out who I was outside of the Ashford name and the Sullivan household and the legacy that everyone kept reminding me I was supposed to carry. Like it was a cross. Like it was a crown made of thorns. Robert had not taken it well.
He had, in fact, shown up at her mother's house, technically the Ashford family home, where Margaret's mother had lived until her death 6 years earlier and where Margaret was technically staying, though she had barely left her room in the 2 weeks since coming home from the hospital with Connor, and he had stood in the foyer in his $800 suit and his wedding ring, and he had said, very quietly, that if she left, she should not expect to come back. Not the marriage. Not the family. Not the money. Not the life. Margaret's father, Howard Ashford, who was 71 at the time, a man built like a brick wall and twice as immovable, a man who had rebuilt his father's company from near bankruptcy in 1971 and had run it with an iron fist and a moral compass that pointed exclusively toward profit, had made the same point with considerably more volume. He had come downstairs in his robe and slippers.
This man who had not raised his voice in 40 years of boardroom battles, and he had screamed at Margaret in the foyer until the neighbors across the street could hear him through the closed windows. He told her she was a disgrace. He told her she was throwing away a dynasty. He told her that if she walked out that door, she would not be his daughter anymore. He told her that the $800,000 trust fund he had set up in her name when she was 21, the one that vested at 30,
the one that every Ashford heir received on the milestone birthday that symbolized their entry into adulthood, he told her he would revoke it. He would restructure it. He would leave it to Richard and Richard's children and the company and the charities and anything but her. She walked out. She got in her car, a red Mustang convertible she'd bought behind Robert's back because he'd forbidden it, which should have told her everything she needed to know about the architecture of her marriage, about the way Robert loved, controlling, protective, proprietary, and she drove. She drove until she hit the ocean in North Carolina. Then she turned left and drove until she hit the ocean again in California. It took her 3 weeks. She stopped at motels that charged by the hour. She ate at diners and truck stops and one extraordinary meal at a roadside place outside Amarillo where the cook was a woman from Guatemala who made tamales from memory and served them with a salsa that Margaret later tried to recreate in 12 different states and never once came close. She played the radio so loud she couldn't hear herself think. She screamed along the songs she hated. She pulled over in rest areas and slept for 4 hours and woke up with her neck aching and no idea where she was. And somewhere in the desert outside Flagstaff, Arizona, she screamed. She screamed out the window at the stars, at the moon, at the vast indifferent dark of the high desert, and she screamed until her throat tore, until she tasted blood. Until the sound that came out of her was not a scream anymore, but something deeper and more animal and more true than any sound she had made in 30 years of being the perfect daughter, the perfect girlfriend, the perfect fiancée, the perfect bride, the perfect almost mother. And then she laughed. She laughed so hard she thought she'd never stop, and she gripped the steering wheel with both hands, and she drove into the night, and she did not stop for anything until she reached the Pacific. That was the Margaret I remembered from college. The one who danced on tables. The one who stayed up all night reading Dostoevsky in Russian, her third language after English and the Mandarin her grandmother had taught her as a child, and then would come to our dorm room at dawn with her hair uncombed and her eyes burning and read us passages aloud because she said the music of the language was more important than the meaning. That meaning was for people who hadn't suffered yet, and music was for people who had learned to hear what couldn't be said. The one who told me, sophomore year, lying on the carpet of our dorm room in the dark, that she sometimes felt like she had a second self inside her, a wilder one, like an animal that had been caged so long it forgot what freedom smelled like but never forgot how to want it. And that one day that self was going to break free and nothing would ever be the same. "I want you to know," she said, setting her cup down on my kitchen table and looking at me directly, "that I do not regret it. I need you to understand that before I tell you the rest. I need you to understand that as the foundation, as the bedrock, as the one true thing I know in a life that has been full of uncertainties and bad decisions and beautiful disasters. I have spent 25 years out in the world, sealing things, doing things, being someone other than Margaret Ashford Sullivan. I have been broke and rich and broke again. I have loved people I will never see again, and I have left people who loved me, left them in parking lots and airport terminals, and once, memorably, on a boat in the San Juan Islands because I woke up one morning and the man beside me was someone I had been pretending to be in love with and I couldn't pretend anymore. I have done things that would make you drive me to the bus station and never speak to me again. And I do not regret it. Not one day of it. Not one single day, Carolyn. And I include in that the days that were terrible. The days I was so low I didn't know how I would make it to the next morning. Those days too. Because those days were mine. They belonged to me in a way that nothing in the Ashford house or the Sullivan house ever did. I believed her. That was the terrifying part. She looked even sitting in my kitchen in her ruined clothes, even with $11 and a garbage bag, even with the mascara she wasn't wearing smudged under her eyes in a way that made her look younger, more vulnerable, more Margaret than I had seen her in decades. She looked free. There was something in her bearing, something in the way she sat in that chair like she owned it and the house and the street and the whole damn state of Connecticut, that made my own life, my 30-year marriage to Tom, my mortgage, my kids' college tuitions, my Tuesday night book club where we read books about other people's messy lives and then went home to our own orderly ones, feel like a costume I had put on 30 years ago and hadn't figured out how to remove yet. "Tell me the rest," I said. "Tell me all of it. Love quiet, forbidden midlife romance?" Subscribe to Noah's Awakening for more slow burn stories. The first 5 years, she told me, were the best. And then the worst. And then something in between that she had no name for, something she lived inside for a long time before she understood what it was. She had money, not Robert's money, not her father's money, but money she had quietly, shrewdly, almost compulsively stashed away in the years before Connor was born. Margaret was many things, but she was not stupid. She had watched her father manage a manufacturing empire since she was a child, had sat at the dinner table where the conversation was always about margins and supply chains and the federal interest rate and the cost of brass and steel, and she understood cash flow, understood compounding interest, understood leverage in ways that went beyond the financial. She had opened accounts in her maiden name, Margaret Ashford, not Margaret Sullivan, and she had salted away enough that when she walked out, she had approximately $800,000 and no debt. She had done this methodically, deliberately, over the course of 3 years, with the kind of quiet discipline that Howard Ashford would have admired in anyone but his own daughter. "I gave Robert the house," she said. The house on Belleville Avenue in New Canaan, the one with the pool and the guest house in the kitchen that cost more than most people in Bridgeport's yearly income. I gave him the cars, the Mercedes, the Range Rover, the Jeep for the winter. I gave him the portfolio, the stocks, the retirement accounts, all of it. I kept the cash. He never knew about it. I don't think it ever occurred to him that I might have been planning this for years. He thought I was a kept woman who had no idea how the finances worked. That's what he wanted me to be. And I let him want it because it was easier than arguing. She moved to Santa Fe first. Bought a small adobe house on the outskirts of town, the kind with thick walls that kept out the heat and a courtyard full of lavender and that bloomed in August in colors that looked artificial but weren't. The house had a studio, a separate building in the backyard, whitewashed brick, with skylights in the ceiling and a concrete floor that was always cool in the morning. He painted there. Not well, but with an intensity that frightened her sometimes, that left her shaking at the end of a session not from exhaustion but from the sheer physical release of putting something on paper that had been locked inside her for years. She took pottery classes at a community center downtown. She learned to cook, really cook, not the catered event cooking of Bridgeport society but actual food, with garlic and olive oil and chilies and the kinds of spices that made your eyes water and your nose run and your whole body feel awake in a way that champagne and canapes never had. She read novels all day. She went through a period of reading nothing but Russian literature, all 40 hours of it, because she said Chekhov was the only writer who understood what it felt like to be a woman trapped inside a life she hadn't chosen. And then she read him again, faster. And this time she understood Dostoevsky differently too, understood that the suffering wasn't the point, the bearing of it was the point, the conscious choice to bear it was its own kind of freedom. She swam at the public pool in the mornings, the one at the community center where old men did water aerobics and teenage boys practiced laps, and Margaret floated in the deep end on her back and watched the sky change color as the sun came up. She slept without dreaming for the first time in years. She woke up without an alarm. She did not answer her phone because she had given the number to almost no one and the people who had it mostly didn't call. And then, because Margaret was Margaret, because stillness was a state she had inherited an allergy to, because her blood ran on restlessness and possibility and the particular American disease of believing that the next place, the next person, the next version of yourself was always better than the one you were standing in now, she got bored. I woke up one morning and I realized I had everything I'd asked for, she said. I had solitude and silence and money and health and no one telling me what to do, and I was still empty. Something that felt like an alarm going off inside her soul, like every cell in her body was screaming at her that she was in the wrong place, doing the wrong thing, becoming the wrong person, and no one could hear it but her, and no one could help her because the people who loved her, Robert, her mother, her father, were all people who would have told her this was normal, this was what motherhood felt like, this was the sacrifice, and she should push through it, and she should embrace it. And she should be grateful. I looked at that baby and I thought, if I stay, I will die. She was sitting very still now. Her coffee was gone. She had both hands in her lap, folded together, like she was praying. Not metaphorically. Not slowly. I will die, the self that I am, the person I was born to be, and no one will even notice, because they will see Margaret Sullivan, wife and mother, and they will think I am happy. And I will smile and I will go to the galas and I will stand beside Robert at the company events and I will pour champagne for his clients and I will remember their wives' birthdays and I will raise this child and I will become my mother, who spent 40 years married to my father and never once, not once in 40 years, told me that she was happy. Not once. Who never complained, never cried, never said a word of regret or longing or sorrow. Who just became, gradually, Over the course of my childhood and adolescence and young adulthood, this still, silent, beautiful woman who looked at me sometimes like she was trying to tell me something with her eyes and then would look away before I could understand what it was. I will become that.